Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the official Oscarina nomination coverage for Illusion of Gaia. Illusion of Gaia is an adventure game developed by Quintet and published by Enix. It was released on the Super Nintendo in 1993 and is considered the second entry in a soft trilogy of sorts, the first of which being Soul Blazer and the third being Terranigma. Soul Blazer did not earn any nominations despite being on this season's shortlist, and Terranigma won't compete until next season. Its connection with these other two entries isn't tremendously important since they are all self-contained narratives, and yet the themes they all discuss, that of gods, civilization, human cruelty, and humanity's potential, are present throughout. My name's Mitchell, and I'm your host for the evening. Here with me is none other than the mini-chairman himself, Corbett.
Hi, Mitch. It's me, the mini-chairman. Oh, sorry. Something stuck in my throat. Yep, that's me, mini-chairman himself, Corbett.
Eat a mushroom. Illusion of Gaia earned 7 nominations this season, second best right after Doom and on par with Gabriel Knight. Even though Soul Blazer and ActRaiser 2 didn't garner as much praise, last season saw Quintet take home a win from 4 nominations for the original ActRaiser, so it'll be interesting to see how it'll perform this year with a larger pool of nominations and less clear winners to choose from, but we'll have to wait and see. Here are the nominations for Illusion of Gaia. Best Pixel, 1993. Best Direction. Best Interface. Best Original Score. Best Music Track for In the Earthen Womb. Best Female Character for Kara. And Best Narrative Composition. Okay, so before we jump into things, let's chat just briefly about our background with the game. I actually played this one in college. I think I was just inspired by the original ActRaiser, and I wanted to know more by the Quintet, the developers, and so I played this one. And I actually think I beat it, even though I didn't remember like the ending at all. Like the entire third act was just a complete blur to me for some reason. Which I'm sure we'll talk about when we get to narrative comp, but I did replay it again for this season, so the footage you're watching is all my capture when I went through it again. I'm glad I did. It was a nice kind of refreshing to revisit it once more. What's your experience with it?
Yep, so I would say that, while Mitch is often the master of sampling many, many different games, and I tend to just pick a few and then play them all the way through, Illusion of Gaia was one of the ones that happened to deserve my actually playing the whole thing, and I'm glad I did. It was pretty darn fun as far as the gameplay goes, and helped the story beats land a little longer when they have some nice, gameplay narrative synergy and such. So yeah, good time. Highly recommend it, as evidenced by the many different nominations it's got.
Yeah, Quintet games are something special, and I feel like they're a little bit of an Oscarina darling over here, if I might be so bold, just because they just are willing to take chances and do very new and different things, and a lot of the stuff they do, you see being replicated, especially in the indie scene nowadays, and it's cool to see how it emerged all the way back in 1993. But yeah, we're gonna jump right into it. In Illusion of Gaia, you play as Will, growing up in a school as an orphan. As it happened, Will's parents are explorers, and on one such occasion to the Tower of Babel, Will was separated from his parents, who are then presumed dead in the tower. Shortly after, Will's father visits him as a ghost and sets him off on a journey across the world to find 6 mystic statues that will unlock the secrets held within the Tower of Babel. And that's about the best I could do to sum up this very peculiar story. Alright, so I think let's talk about Best Female Character now. This is for Kara. She's the aforementioned princess character. With that comes no shortage of entitlement, right? She longs to get out of the castle and see the world. Even though she is easily bothered from commoner lifestyles, including extensive walking and smelly homes, but her judgments don't last as she matures. It's also worth noting that even though she is a bit bratty, she is not unkind. There are multiple instances where she treats those around her with care and kindness instead of defaulting into seeing herself as above them. In one such sequence, we see her refuse to eat raw fish while trapped on the raft with Will. Her primary reason, however, is that she says the fish have feelings too and are too pretty to eat. Eventually, she does conform to reason since it's either that or going hungry. A lot of people don't actually like Kara, but I thought her journey was one of the more clear themes of the story. Her not eating the fish because they are too pretty and have feelings is a sweet but shallow way to view the current situation. Regardless, it's an authentic response for someone who has been pampered for much of her life, and so I thought that actually helped redeem her character quite a bit. I thought it was fairly reasonable.
Yeah, adding on to what you said about Kara being sheltered, I would say that while Kara's sheltered existence at times makes the adventuring more difficult for the rest of her group than it needs to be, her sheltered existence also allows her to question much of the suffering in the world which everyone else takes for granted. Aside from when she is on the raft and chastises Will for hurting the fish, she also drops a pretty profound line when Will murders the mercenary that's been stalking them for the entire game. Why must everyone hate each other? Kara's despondency at the death of someone who outwardly appears evil helps make sure that players don't forget about the suffering that they inflict, even when it is necessary. And her question causes us to reflect on how much our violence is or is not driven by malice, and how much this malice really is necessary. Kara also drops another profound line in her letter that she sends to Will. After Will has been sitting in prison for a number of days, the letter Kara writes says, "I too am a prisoner, in a prison of silk and gold." It helps to reflect that, similar to Will's literal imprisonment, many other people in the world are also trapped by systems of power and obligation, even if it is not outwardly apparent. And as such, perhaps we should be more willing to have compassion on one another for the prisons they may suffer from which we cannot see.
I think that's a really great way to kind of surmise her philosophy, I guess, for lack of a better term. I mean, she doesn't come across as the smartest character in the room, that's for sure. But that doesn't mean that she doesn't have kind of her own moral compass that she's following. You know, she might not be lovable, but she is believable. And her presence in this story shows how commoners, as well as the very privileged, can be unaware of cruel inhumanities, like you were saying. For example, Neil is not royal, but he discovers slavery happening within the roots of his hometown, which shakes his faith with his family and humanity as a whole. As many of the characters are forced to grow up, I find Kara represents that theme best because she has the background of being an entitled princess, so she's the one who probably has the most capacity to grow, you might argue, because she has been so sheltered and her exposure to the world has been so limited. And I find like her willingness to actually be engaged with this stuff is something that kind of acts in her favor as opposed to her being stuck up throughout the whole game. I mean, if she was just a stuck up princess, she wouldn't be here, but the fact that she goes through transformations and learns to adapt and is able to articulate her reasons for things, and the other characters don't let her get off the hook either. You know, I think that all of this stuff actually goes a good way of redeeming her character. They don't come up and just give her a free pass and treat her like a princess. Instead, they're like, oh, you're just not being practical, you know?
Yeah, all fair points. I do think that since Kara comes from a very unusual background and has some rather noteworthy and pronounced starting qualities, it makes it easier for her to undergo growth when she encounters the real world. It's part of the reason why I like characters that have a bit more of a punctual edge to their character as opposed to just the well-rounded everyman type of characters.
So let's then use that as a jumping off point to talk about the narrative composition. So the story is told from Will's perspective, and he occasionally offers narration over the events happening. I really like that the kids actually act like real children, complete with their curiosity, pettiness, and simple passions on full display. The theme of growth is ever present as Will comes into his own. Characters will mention this to him as time goes on, actually. Express regret over selfishness, such as Kara's diary, and there's this whole painting sequence. And Lance, who expresses his love to Lily, and even journeys on his own to find a cure for his ailing father. So it's a nice tale about children growing up. It's also a story about human needs. Hunger, slavery, even the guy who gambles with his life in order to earn a living depicts a world in which humans are constantly in need. It has no survival mechanics, but that's because it is more spiritually minded. It's hard to feel like the commentary it makes is meaningful when so much of it comes with so few answers. However, there are big questions it's asking. World hunger, human bondage, these things all have immediate simple solutions. Someone's hungry, feed them. Someone is imprisoned, free them. And yet, this childlike view of these situations is somehow not enough to solve these problems. Adults enact these crimes against one another, and to expect the story to have some ham-fisted sermon Preaching to the player about how terrible everything is would come across as burdening the wrong person. Kids can't fix these things, and so neither can the player. Kids can't even fully comprehend the gravity of what these traumatic experiences are like. They do have run-ins with it, though, where they begin to taste those bitter realities. Any harsher and the game would be kinda sick by putting kids through some pretty awful things.
As a mild correction to that, Mitch means more sick than it already is.
Fair enough. Any clearer, however, and you would leave no room for the player to realize how beautiful it is to be a child and to not fully know the severity of the darker sides of humanity. The process of revisiting this mindset makes you realize how far away you get from your own child optimism. I know a lot of that actually doesn't have to do with like the story beats. The story beats, I don't know that I would elaborate much of them because it feels so theme-based. Characters seem to whimsically talk about this sort of simplistic worldview that they have, and you're just strutting along throughout the quest. So this is kind of like the themes that it made me think of. These were like the larger topics it brought up, and that was kind of more or less my interpretation when I reached the end.
Yeah, it is kind of funny in a way, like, the NPCs are like talking about all this, like, profound stuff that doesn't get elaborated on very much. It's like, in some ways, it feels like a Dark Souls NPC mixed with the "Sir, this is a Wendy's" meme, where it's just like you're this 12-year-old kid walking around, and it's like, "Oh, hey, be sure to cherish the ones you love, kids." It's like, okay, moving on.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So what was your takes on the story then?
Yeah, so I would say that the events of the story try much more than the average game to have profound messages that reflect on the whole of humanity. My top 3 examples that haven't already been alluded to, though I found many more where that came from when I was going through the game script again. There's one scene where Eric says, "But Seth didn't have a human form," and Nier replies, "No, Eric, don't jump to conclusions. Only humans think that human shape is the best one." Translation issues, but you get what they're saying. There's another segment where a laborer says, "I do not believe in spirits. If there were spirits, things like status wouldn't matter." And then later in the game, it's showed that spirits do exist. And the rich person's spirit looks exactly the same as other people, and even animals. So it doesn't outright state it there, but it's kind of trying to show you that, hey, us humans were really not that different. We all have a soul, so we should really not be quite as uppity about all this status and such. There's also a segment where Kara is on the raft after a number of days, and she says to Will, "With you by my side, I can even enjoy times like these." So it's kind of a corny line, but I do kind of think that it's a bit profound at showing how something as simple as another person's company can make or break an experience for you, even being starving on a raft after a number of days. Adding on to what I alluded to earlier, the overarching message of the story is about how too much change in humanity leads to increased evil and suffering. The main villain of the game, if you can call it that, is a comet that has come to Earth and is causing many people and creatures to undergo evolution much quicker than would otherwise. The game presents a number of scenarios, and several of these showcase this evolution causing severe problems for people. In one case, people are turned into angels. They are said to be the most evolved form of humanity, but they can't feel any emotions, and one even ends up effectively killing himself. There's also a segment where some people end up becoming undying spirits who aren't necessarily happier in that state. One of them comments, "With my body gone, I became forever young. From the comet's life, I gained immortality. But is there meaning in eternal life? I felt more alive when I had a terminal disease." The commentary the game has between change and suffering is not limited to strictly fantastical set pieces. The light of the comet also seems to be causing technology to advance much quicker than it did in our real-life Earth. This is perhaps drawing a link between the concepts, and is perhaps saying that technology itself is our own world's version of evolving too quickly. In addition, the evil consequences in the game include some of the same evils that have been perpetrated in our own world, such as slavery, poverty and starvation, exploitation of people for profit, self-sacrifice of people for profit, and the Spanish conquest of the Incan Empire. By bringing up real-life examples, the game is perhaps hinting that some of the suffering and atrocities in our own history may in fact be because humans change too quickly. The reasons why the speed of change leads to more evil is left somewhat ambiguous. Perhaps it's because humanity is not mature enough for these changes. Perhaps it is because it is easier for evil people to capitalize on change before they are understood or widespread. Whatever your conclusion, it provides for interesting food for thought, and it makes you wonder if we, as humans, ought to question narratives about the forward progress of humanity being inherently positive, and if perhaps instead, we ought to consider changing less rapidly in order to mitigate the evils that may occur as a result of that change. I also thought, as a more simple note, that it's pretty interesting that you get to travel with a bunch of fairly normal kid friends. It goes to show that you can have stories about adventurous journeys without needing everyone in the traveling party to also be seasoned adventurers. You can just have them waiting in town and visit with them in between adventuring sessions, and the storytelling still works pretty well, in my opinion. It's also cool that you get to visit locations from real life and real legends. You end up getting to visit the Incan Empire, the Nazca Lines, Mu, which is the fabled lost continent, possibly linked to Atlantis, Angkor Wat, the Great Wall of China. All these locations help the player experience an added sense of awe and adventure. And the added sense of adventure may help the story's profound messages reach a larger audience, since it makes the story more fun in a traditional sense.
I wonder how well this is coming across, because like on the one hand, you've got like little kids going on an adventure, doing fun things. And then on the other hand, you've got like this really serious tone with like horrible, horrible human atrocities that are happening around them. And then you have, this really interesting tidbit about history with like visiting all these fascinating locations in real life. There's a kind of real strength, I guess, in the fact that the game is willing to tackle all of this and just power on forward. I mean, it certainly makes it a unique beast. There's nothing like it it's certainly from the era, and even like nowadays, this is kind of one of the great things about Quintet in general, is just they make very truly original games that have no real comparison. They just march to their own drumbeat, and there's definitely something commendable to that. But I think with that, also comes a responsibility to actually address the things they bring up in a way that's really tactile and meaningful for us. And I think that's where I'm not always certain that the script actually accomplishes that. I think there's like a number of places where, and it's like, I hesitate to like point to a specific spot, but it just feels like there's this overall sense of like, I'm not sure where you're going with all this and how it all adds up. And I think a part of that is possibly its bad translation.
Yeah, I also was not a huge fan of the translation personally. So, like, for example, when you lose your health and you respawn in dark space, Will says, "I am aware of having fallen in a place I know. Must have been a nightmare." So, I mean, for me, I remember the first time that happened, and it's like, what? Huh? Let me reread that a couple of times and stuff, because it just came across as very awkward and unclear, especially because you can't review your previous text log. So, yeah, there's a lot of instances of that where the translation makes it come across as more unclear and also a bit less human feeling.
Mm-hmm. I venture to guess too that Quintet had a specific like person that they typically had translate their games. And I'm just going out on a limb and saying that because it has the same kind of quirks that showed up in ActRaiser and Soul Blazer and, spoilers for Robo Trek for next season. It's just like there's this reoccurring, like, I just don't even know how to describe it, but there's these gaps where it's translated, but you feel that it's been translated and you feel this sense of something has been lost along the way. And so it's great that they did an English localization for Western players, but also I just don't always feel confident in that translation. I mean, the Dragon Quest V translation, which was done by a fan, felt like a more faithful. I mean, it was at least clear. It was definitely legible. There was no instances of just being totally lost over what someone was saying. And it's not like it happens once or twice in this game. It happens pretty often. I would say at least like 1/10 of the game maybe has, and that's maybe being even a little generous, where there's just these lines that come out and you're like, I'm not entirely sure what to do with that, but okay, sure.
Yeah, it's kind of funny from playing a lot of these older video games. In some ways, it's actually caused me a bit more nice, I will say, as far as the early days of fan translation on anime, because like a lot of those, people poke fun at how they just inject a bunch of curse words and stuff like that.
Yeah,
But I
yeah.
mean, at least they were decent, and in some cases, I mean, I still think
could
that the
follow it.
Illusion of Gaia translation is decent, but like some of these other games we're playing are not really decent in my opinion. So,
yeah, well, and
yeah.
I would rather have something be a little more obtuse and kind of confusing than to have it just be generic schlock like, some of the other games that we had as options. Like, plumbers don't wear ties, for example.
Oh, jeez. Yeah.
Or like, there was one actually I just discovered recently. It's called Sewer Shark, and it's as bad as it sounds. And
oh my.
Yeah, not good at all. So, not gonna beat myself up over not evaluating it sooner, because it would have. I think it was a Sega CD game for '92, and it's just like, all right, this is ridiculous. So, yeah, I would rather have something that it's at least making a good effort to talk about something deeper and more meaningful in life, and it's definitely more commendable and award worthy, as we might say.
Yep, for sure.
There are some other cons, though, with the script that we should probably cover. For one, characters are a bit generic and underdeveloped. I know this is a point that you marked down, but I actually agree with you on that. I feel like for the most part, that's true. I do think Kara is a little bit better than that, but even with her, I don't feel like... It doesn't feel like the characters get... I mean, they get their moment on screen to kind of go through their arc, but they don't always get enough to make it clear to the player why that was such an important part of the story, like why it mattered that we got their arc of transformation and how that connects to the larger picture. It's just sort of a thing that happens, and then you're like, cool, why again?
Yeah, I'd say that that's a reasonable assessment overall. I mean, it was enough that I could sort of piece together logically, like, what was going on there, but, like, not enough for me to really, like, feel it emotionally because of the fact that their development, when it does exist, is sparse, and it's just not supplemented also with just a lot of normal dialogue of humans being humans, such that, like, they feel like real people for me personally, but that's kind of a nitpick to a certain extent with a lot of these older JRPGs. So it's not great for Illusion of Gaia, but it might just be a sign of the times and the sign of the SNES having limited cartridge space.
Fair enough. I mean, I don't know. I'm honestly, I feel like on the one hand, I want to say yes, I agree with the signs of the times, but then again, there are definitely some games, I'm thinking of one in particular for next season, that definitely does not share this problem. So,
yep.
Who knows how we feel about the standard. What else?
Well, I mean, it sounds silly, but like, games are evolving at an extremely rapid pace during this era of game development. I mean, like 1990 was like the first games that had, at least from what I can tell, like a really good, well-developed story. And it's like only been like 4 years from then, and we're talking about these games here. So, even just a difference of like a year or two. I mean, like the Final Fantasy games too. It's like Final Fantasy IV was the first that had any story, and that was only like 1 or 2 years before. I mean, not any story, but sizable chunk of story. So yeah, even in just the span of a year or two, I think that these games are making vast advances in storytelling and other aspects.
You think that's in part because we're covering 2 years in one season?
I guess so, but I also would say that just the nature of the evolving technology and artistry means that 1 year of 1990s time is like a lot more advances than 1 year in 2020's time.
Yeah, I think you are onto something, because 1990 you get 16-bit graphics. I mean, I guess you technically had that before on the Sega Genesis, I think, for maybe a year or two at most, because I know the Sega Genesis came out earlier. But yeah, so you had that.
It's actually only like 1 year and a half or so. It came out in August of 1989, and I think the SNES was the end of 1990 or so.
Okay, so about a year and a half. So, turn of the decade, you get 16-bit graphics, and then a couple years after that, in 92, you get access to Sega CD games. So now you have FMVs and much higher audio quality. It's just like a wildly different space, and games are just so fascinating because their usage of technology is just very, very unique among art forms. typically you have an art medium that you use, you know, whether that's your paints or your film reel or your pencil and your paper. It's just kind of like it's more straightforward. But with games, it's not like that. And they have so many different tools that they will utilize. And also, this is something I'm going to talk about more in the Myst episode, if you've not already seen that. And that one, like the tools they use to develop that game is like really fascinating, because some of it was not even like stuff for games specifically. It was like a program for something that had completely ulterior purposes. Nowadays we have programs specifically for designing games, but that wasn't necessarily indicative of the time. So yeah, I guess there's something to that they just evolved very, very rapidly. They're kind of like, you know, a kid that hit a growth spurt and just skyrocketed very, very quickly.
I wouldn't suppose the name of that program was Microsoft PowerPoint. Sorry. Sorry, I couldn't resist.
I mean, that's perfect. You better say it now, because you won't be on the Myst Talk, so...
Yeah, exactly. Gotta say my piece now while I can.
Oh, boy. All right, any other cons on narrative comp for Illusion of Gaia?
Yeah. The last con I wanted to bring up is that I personally wish that they explored the themes about humanity and how it changes more in depth. The general style of the game tends to be more drop a profound quote and move on, and to not drop a profound quote and explore the nitty-gritty nuance of it. I still like the game's existing narrative style, but I think I like the in-depth approach more. That being said, my friend did point out to me that I generally have a bias towards in-depth media, so take that, you know, into account when I mention it as a con.
So you do, but also I don't, and I agree with this point. In this case, I don't think you're being biased. I think you're absolutely right. There's just not enough here for me. Like, again, I admire it and I appreciate it. I'm glad it's nominated. I think you should play this game. I think this is a game definitely worth revisiting. I think a lot of people have kind of, you know, glossed over it without giving it too strong of a chance. But I also think history has done that in part because there is kind of a gap here in what's going on with its narrative versus what's happening, like what it actually needs to do to consolidate some of these themes in a package that really resonates with people in a deep and meaningful way. So yeah, I don't think you're wrong about that at all. So let's talk about the direction then and see how that kind of clarifies things a little bit. So you follow the misadventures of a group of children, one of which you play, and play is the best word to describe it because the game creates a profound connection between the player actions and the story. In a sequence where Will and Kara must survive on a raft, you may slash the flying fish for food. As a player, you are in a confined space with nothing to occupy yourself, so it organically encourages a bit of youthful rebellion.
Yeah, personally, I thought that the whole raft scene was very effective use of direction. So there are periods on the raft where you have to just wait until something happens, which emphasizes the passage of time and shows how Will and Kara really are stranded without any outside help. As time passes and the two get more and more hungry, Kara will only let you start hunting the fish when your health is minimal, which indicates that you're starving. I also really appreciate the fact that if you want to actually obtain the fish to save your lives, you have to hit them with your sword. Hitting the fish is instinctual for the player since that's how you've been primarily interacting with the world until this point. But then Kara calls you out on how brutal it is to the fish, and it makes you reflect on how it is kind of weird that we as humans inflict harm so casually when we are desensitized to it, and how people like Kara, who are not acclimated to it, would consider the action with more weight. Towards the end of the raft segment, sharks surround the raft and ominous music plays. Same music that plays during a number of conflict situations during the game until that point.
Mm-hmm.
Per video game logic, and Will's background as an adventurer, you think it's going to be a boss fight. And when it isn't, it really emphasizes Kara's words about how even creatures in nature don't attack when they're not hungry. Will is spared via something of an act of mercy from the sharks, which makes you reflect all the more on the greed of humanity.
Yeah, the raft scene, I think, elevates this game a tremendous amount. I don't think it could be overstated. This is a really challenging game to talk about in some ways because it's a game that a lot of people like but don't have a very clear understanding of what it's about. And I'm not even sure that Corbett and I have a perfect vision on it either. We're just going to do our best to sort of hit you with all the thoughts of themes and ideas that the game brings up, and we're going to try to sort of bring that into a cohesive picture. For instance, you're talking about like kind of hunger and cruelty. I think those are very prominent themes in the game, along with the themes of slavery, animal life, growing up, and uncovering lost civilizations of humanity. That's all intertwined together. At first glance, there may not appear to be a single coherent message, but regardless of how buried it is, ultimately this ambiguity, you could call it, makes the game worth revisiting, because you get to experience the world as a kid again, and everything you are exposed to is only temporary because, like a child, these things are all new and there are no clear answers. And so I think part of the strength of the direction here is that because you're a child viewing these deep things that are so much larger than yourself, it sort of alleviates the player from being able to decipher a coherent solitary theme in the end, because it's more about just the experience of being a kid and being shocked at the things that humanity does without having a lot of control or influence on it.
Yeah, I'd say that that's a fair assessment. I mean, I do think that the storytelling works best as far as the more self-contained messages that they try to inject with each individual little city or scene, because some of those can actually work pretty well. Regarding the theme of slavery, one thing that I thought was interesting from a direction perspective is that they made it so that if you want to get all 50 gems, you, the player, need to turn in a slave. And it's not like it does it even with the mercy of a cutscene. You have to be the one who goes over to the slave trader and turns him in. You don't have to do it, but if you want those 50 gems, oh my.
Whoa, I didn't even know you could do that. That's crazy.
Oh yeah. And it has real severe consequences. The slave and the store owner protecting him vanish after you turn the slave in. And previously they were begging you, please don't turn me in, or I just want to protect this store owner. It doesn't even matter what happens to me. But they're gone, so presumably they're enslaved or dead. And the game manual even literally calls you a skunk for doing so. They're explaining you, here's how you do this. And by the way, you suck. So,
wow.
So perhaps having the player do this reflects on the greed of mankind by showing how you, the player, are willing to perpetrate evil when tempted with a reward of some kind. Or perhaps it goes to show how a naive kid can too quickly and easily accept the horrors of the world, and in so doing, perpetrate immense harm. Will might think not much more of it other than just, oh yeah, I mean, everyone tells me that all this slavery is how the world works, so I guess what I'm supposed to do is turn in a slave, and then only afterwards have the horror set in of just how much of a problem that is. But, somewhat speculative. I'm just saying that's one possible interpretation.
Yeah.
Afterwards, you have a chance to rescue some slaves, which lets Will partially redeem his mistake. And if you do get all 50 gems, you get to defeat one of the primary figures encouraging the slave trade. It shows how, despite some mistakes, at the end of the day, Will is not willing to accept the suffering present in the world as being inevitable and unchanging, like many others have in the world that you inhabit. That being said, though, I personally didn't like that they kind of portray the slave trade as being largely caused by a single evil guy, rather than being more of a deep-seated problem with humanity. In my opinion, it makes the story a little less thought-provoking, even if it does help you get a better redemption for the slave he turned in earlier. So, a little rough around the edges, but on the whole, I liked it.
Not to disagree, because I think I mostly agree with you, but a part of it could be because my whole take on this is that it's sort of the lens of a child, and so having one archetypical big bad guy that they can just put all the blame onto, it's very it makes sense as a kid. Like, normally the world of a child's mind is depicted as black and white, good or bad. And Illusion of Gaia paints a concerning picture of man's inhumanity to man and the inhumanity to oneself. The entire cast of characters goes through long periods of hunger, abandonment, and uncertainty about their future. When these trials end, they bounce back to their usual happy selves and partake in exciting adventures, as kids will do. Will is at the forefront of these exploits, and the balance of half-action, half-puzzle gameplay pushes the player towards growth, accomplishment, and exhilaration before the control is subtly combined for the next rough patch in the story. Like I said, I don't know if it's a point of disagreement, but part of the lens is just that because it's a child, they have childlike solutions to some of the problems in the game. And I would be willing to go out on that argument just on the fact that there is such heavy themes present in this story. It's a little weird because they're not deeply developed. If it was just like a child's game, then I don't think they would have bothered with some of this mature subject matter. I think they would have gone with something much more mundane, like dragons are taking over the world, we have to stop them, or something silly like that.
So many Rescue the Princess narratives in the last few years for the Game Awards.
Oh my gosh, all the fantasy princess rescuing narratives. Freaking A. So many.
But yeah,
especially when, as funny. You said, I'm sampling like thousands of games is what it feels like.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because, I mean, I don't even know if you could argue that, like, you know, Quintet's inherently making this as a game for adults either. Because, I mean, the kind of stories that they make are really not much like all the other games of the era. It seems much more like they're kind of just making a story for themselves as far as the kind of things that they find spiritually enlightening or whatnot, and then you end up with these crazy adventures where you're dealing with all this metaphysical stuff. It's great in concept, such that we, you know, wanted to shower it with lots of nominations at least, but, you know, time will tell whether it ends up getting any wins or not.
Yeah, agreed. Do you have any other thoughts on direction?
Yeah, so aside from the raft, the prison also has a moment where the only way to progress the story is to wait for a while Will ruminates on all the prisoners that must have been there, wasting away hopelessly. The emphasis on time passing and making it feel really long causes the player to feel some existential dread and realize how helpless we humans are when faced with the perils of imprisonment at corrupt governments and the passing of time. There are also periods where you'll be talking to someone or something will happen and the music just goes dead silent, which in my opinion works very well at emphasizing the tension of the scene that they're trying to convey. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I thought that those were two other nice little tidbits as far as direction goes.
So let's move on and talk about interface now. So I actually have quite a bit to say when it comes to the interface. I think I was surprised at how much that it really appealed to me, because on the surface it looks pretty simple. But unlike other interfaces, this one is truly invisible, which is the best compliment an interface can be given. There is your usual health bar and item menu screen, but these elements are simple and kept to a minimum. When the game needs to tell you anything else, it will do so with the world. Dialogue text is color-coded to match unique characters and displayed on pure black background, so it's easy as could be to read. The save room is a portal into dark space, which only Will can see. This moment is particularly strong because save menus are either just that, or they are thinly veiled as someone keeping a journal log of your progress. And those are all great, but it's refreshing to have it exist in a dimension only your progress has, or your protagonist has access to, just as you, the player, exist in another dimension. So it's kind of like a bit of a meta take there. There's also the switch in the first dungeon that is too rusted to push, so you have to use the weight of your body by jumping from a high platform to press it. Then you have another button you can't reach, and the solution is to switch places with a character Freedan. Freedan, of course, is this alternate character that you can play as. Will sort of transforms himself into an adult warrior for some bizarre reason. You can't reach the button as Will, and then you swap to Freedan, and then he can slash it with his sword over the rock simply because he's a larger sprite on the screen. So they didn't adjust anything else about the game, they just made it so that you're playing a different character now and he's bigger, so of course he can reach it. And the best part about this is that you make these conclusions by simple intuition, rather than have a character explain it or have Freedan just smash something. There's no changes to the environment, only the character sprites, but that's the only change the player notices, and so the game rewards your instincts. And that's the key here. It's surprising when you jump off a building to be stopped by someone who's horrified at your teen tomfoolery. Even Will's hair, which is initially just a nice visual element, is later used to signify wind blowing through cracks in cave walls. His childlike animations, ladder climbing, and the screen transition when going upstairs are all so smooth, leading to an extremely tactile sensation throughout. Going back to that raft sequence, there's no flashy marker to tell you that you can slash the flying fish when you're on the raft, you just intuit that you can. And then, since you're stranded and in need of food, you pick up the fish and see your health meter gradually refill. A mechanical acknowledgement of what's happening narratively, in this case eating fish, is more common nowadays, but this is impressive to see it all the way back in 1993. So, even though the menus and things like that are done well, it's really less about the menus, why it's nominated, or even the challenge of compartmentalizing, and more to do with just the unyielding world engagement throughout the whole game. The fact that the game establishes a precedence via all these moments I mentioned, that you really just aren't going to know the extent of what is interactable and what isn't. And this goes a long way in making the world feel completely boundless. This then expands your mind into making the game world significantly more believable. Many of these are scripted sequences, sure, but they happen in such obviously intuitive moments in retrospect that they click. And so it's a great way that to just merge gameplay, story, and most importantly for interface, making sure the player understands what it is that they're supposed to do in order to interact and progress through the game.
Yeah, so that's a very good write-up you have there, Mitch, and I definitely agree with you that you had a lot to say there. I remember specifically that I was looking over the script and comparing your points to mine, and I'm like, oh, wow, I feel a lot dumber in comparison because my points are a lot more simple. Nevertheless, even though they're a bit more simple, I mean, I also personally rather appreciated the interface of Illusion of Gaia, albeit in ways that aren't quite as deep as Mitch. So the first thing that I wanted to highlight is that at the very beginning of the game, Will still gets the jump slash ability, where after a slash you can tap forward, and Will jump forward and perform a second slash, which does more damage, but puts him at more risk. This adds some additional complexity, which adds an extra layer of challenge and fun for the introductory levels, such that you're not just doing a totally bland hack and slash of just walking around and hitting the A button. I also really appreciate how powers are introduced gradually, such that you have the opportunity to master them before you get a new one. The game also makes it so that different players can double tap in order to run, as compared with the archetypical hold B to run from Pokemon and the like. You can still get around fast, but it requires skill to run for long stretches. And because of the thought required to execute it, and because it isn't always easy to switch between running and normal movement, running is a decision that requires some tactical thought, and isn't something that your brain will just turn into a habit without thinking about it, like holding B to run. I also really liked all 4 of Will's unique attacks, especially the Psycho Slider. So the powers you acquire are needed to traverse certain obstacles, but they also each have a use in battle. In fact, each power has a unique use case of when you're going to use it in order to dispatch enemies. All the powers involve a lot of movement, which helps give Will the feeling of being a small, fast character in comparison to Frieden's bulky, strong nature. The abilities are very powerful, but they still require skill to use, and in my opinion, they don't trivialize the game. The last thing I mentioned in favor of interface for Illusion of Gaia is that there's several segments in the game where you need to run super fast down hills and running off jumps to get to some new area on the other side. In general, the feeling just felt exhilarating and never got old for me, so that was also something that was nice as far as interface goes.
And I think all of that lends well to the kind of childlike intuition that I was talking about. You know, kids, I feel like by and large are more instinctual, or they're more willing to act on instinct without kind of thinking through a bunch of layered logistics, right? And so it being a simple control scheme, I think, lends itself to that as well.
Totally. That being said, there were a few things that were a bit less than ideal for me. For one thing, when Will unlocks the spin dash, the poor translation makes it very unclear how you're supposed to execute it. However, there is a clear explanation in the manual, and once I understood how to execute it and got some practice with it, it was still a fun tool to use in battle. So, not great, but it's doable and solvable if you just look at the manual or a guide. The game also, unfortunately, makes it so that dialogue will advance when you press a directional key. This results in a fair amount of accidentally missed dialogue, some of which you can't get by talking to people a second time, which is very unfortunate for me.
Yeah, that actually sucks because it's a game that's already really esoteric and obtuse. And so the fact that you can accidentally skip crucial dialogue, although maybe it's a blessing in disguise because maybe that dialogue would just have confused you even more because it doesn't always actually help your explanation of what's going on. So yeah, who knows with that one.
In my opinion, it's unfortunate that the game is oftentimes a bit esoteric as far as how they explain things, because there would be times where I accidentally skip something and then I'm like, wait, what the heck are they saying? So I would literally go to a long play online and find the exact timestamp and listen to them talk, and then afterwards I'm like, no, I'm still confused. Well, shoot, that sucks.
Yeah. Oh boy.
And then last thing that's a bit of a nitpick as far as interface goes is that I personally didn't like the Aura Barrier or Earthquaker special abilities for Freedan quite as much as Will's abilities. The Earthquaker is only useful when you're jumping off cliffs, which is not very often, and the Aura Barrier requires a lot of charging time and startup time. So, not the best abilities, but Freedan's still a perfectly usable fighter with his slashing and his beam shooting and such, so it's fine. It's not the end of the world.
Yeah, that's fair. To kind of close out our thoughts on interface, the best kind of interface is the one that pulls you completely into the game. But Illusion of Gaia isn't satisfied with that and instead prioritizes finding ways to communicate clues, paths, or story information via the context of the game world. It's a small thing that probably isn't easy to notice just by looking at it, but it is more clever than its presentation permits. So, yeah, I do agree that there's a few drawbacks for sure, part of it having to do with translation, and the other part of it just, you know, not being conscientious enough about preventing us from accidentally skipping dialogue or whatnot. But, you know, in the end, I do think its merits are quite strong. In fact, I think it's one of the strongest in a pretty competitive category, not just because it has 6 nominees, but honestly, all of the nominees this year are really good for this category, I felt.
Yep, I'd say that's a fair assessment.
All right, so for Best Original Score, the score has a strong sense of identity with a mixture of wind instrumentation and psychedelic chimes. The wind instruments are a great companion as we see wind in other parts of the world, such as flower petals blowing in the air or Will's hair flopping from ocean breezes. The psychedelics are no doubt connected to the cosmos and the game's interest in planet ecology. They also help explain away the soul transformations into Freedan and Shadow, and the final confrontation on the comet in outer space. Spoilers, I guess.
I would also note that the psychedelic choice of music may be, in fact, a nod to the fact that some of the story makes you feel like you're tripping on mushrooms, but that's more of a personal interpretation, I would say.
I mean, I don't know. This is a game where, like, you have slavery and stuff, so...
You had a bad trip, what can I say?
I kind of wish they would have added something of that in the game, not because I want to see kids doing shrooms, but just because, I don't know, it seems like they were interested in bringing all this mature adult content, so it ought to have a justifiable reason, but yeah.
Well, you'll have to wait until Mother 3, where we have the Nintendo licensed mushroom trip level, where you also endure a number of nightmares of each player's own creation. But yeah, Nintendo approved mushroom trip. That's part of why it didn't come to America, I imagine.
Yep. Freaking Mother games. Oh boy, that'll be a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
The game's interest in music is something of a precursor to Zelda Ocarina of Time. Yes, old Zelda had a musical instrument as well, but this is actually the first game I know of where you learn specific songs to enact specific magical effects, almost like keys. The songs are sometimes even personalized, such as a character's lullaby. You also make regular transformations from being a child into an adult, much like Ocarina of Time. So this is like part of a music comment, but I don't know, it's just sort of a larger suggestion that's interesting how you can actually see Zelda lineage appear in Illusion of Gaia. Because it is introduced in Link to the Past. You have a flute in there. It looks like an ocarina, but it's called a flute. And the flute goes all the way back to the original Zelda, but you just use it to like transport yourself around the map. And then in the Link's Awakening episode, you guys talked a little bit about how that was used in that. And then here we see it again, but in this time, it's kind of takes on a presence that just seems eerily familiar to Ocarina of Time, and it's just kind of a strange portion of the game that I don't really know how to address. And I'm talking around it just because that's how it be with this game. I will say though, as a minor con, I would have liked the score to be a little longer and to specifically lean into the contrasting circumstances Will finds himself in. If Will adopts the body of Freedan or Shadow, having a shift in the music to indicate this, if even a little bit, I think would have been good. Instead, it can kind of, I don't know, it's just sort of back to the same usual music depiction.
Oh, but then you wouldn't have gotten to listen to that dungeon theme for the 20th time, Mitch. I mean, you wouldn't want to deprive us of that now, would you?
Yeah, they did reuse that quite a bit, which I'm sure will be in our cons section. But let's keep things positive for the time being. What did you like about the music?
Yeah. So don't get me wrong. I kid about the things I found a bit annoying, but on the whole, I did quite like the Illusion of Gaia soundtrack. So the first thing in favor of the soundtrack is that the songs Signs of the Past and Will's Dream are great music to evoke a sense of, as I mentioned earlier, acid tripping in a good way. The mood is very thought-provoking and emotional, and the music feels existential, which matches the often existential storytelling that accompanies these tracks. I also would say that the songs Lola's Melody and Melody of the Wind are pretty and mystical flute melodies that are used to solve certain puzzles. These help set the mood of solving puzzles for ancient civilizations that have knowledge and power beyond our understanding. There's also the songs Itori and Adrift, which are very cozy and fitting for their scenes. Adrift plays during the raft scene that we mentioned earlier, and the cozy music emphasizes the growing bond between Will and Kara, along with their self-improvement as people and their epiphanies that help them to understand the world. And then finally, In the Earthen Womb and To the New World are emotional, profound, and grand, and they make an excellent pair of songs to end the game on. That being said, as far as the cons go, I didn't really like the dungeon themes very much, and these play rather more often than I would like as well. In general, they feel very dissonant, and they tend to mostly add uncomfortable tension rather than making me want to adventure. Aside from that, the game has a single light-hearted town theme that plays in many cities, even when it isn't particularly fitting. The most egregious example of this is when the song plays for the majority of your time in Phrygia, which is the slave town. The happy music does not really match the terrible slavery going on throughout the town. So the soundtrack's got some highs, the soundtrack's got some lows, but there's more highs than lows, so I think it still deserves a spot on our nomination list.
Yeah, the Phrygia one is weird. And it's weird because when you get to the town, it's one of the prettiest locations you get to. There's like flower petals blowing in the wind, and it's just very picturesque and quaint. It's strange that a part of that must be intentional, right? That they have this dark underground situation happening, and the public just sees the things on the surface of the city, and they're not aware of the corruption that's happening. I don't know that the music does the best job of like making that juxtaposition clear, though. I don't, actually, but I don't know if I would argue that it doesn't either. Like, I'm not sure. I think I'm more mixed on that.
Yeah, I definitely do think in some ways that making it initially appear nice is intentional, and I suppose the music emphasizes that. I think that what they could have done in a way that would have been really neat is if they started out being all, picturesque and the music being all chipper and stuff like that, and then once you find out like midway through the level about all the messed up slavery stuff is going on, it would still appear equally picturesque, but then they just have like ominous music playing in the background, and you'll be talking to people like, oh wow, I can't wait for the spring festival, while you just hear in the background. Like, I think that would have been pretty cool, but I'm a bit of a masochist when it comes to tragedy and the like, so that might just be my inner darkness speaking.
I think that's a fair point. And I feel like that's kind of the big con with the score, is it needed to make a choice, right? And it feels like it's without a choice because it's literally just playing a song that we've already heard before. And so, like, I can appreciate that there might have been a choice there, but it also just feels like the absent-minded one because, why isn't it a different variation? Why doesn't it change? Why isn't there just something to communicate that we should be thinking about this in a new way? And instead it just kind of is like, well, let's just use that track. We already have it. If it's fine, is more of how it comes across.
Fair point. So we spent a fair amount of time gushing about the game's overall soundtrack, but next I'd like to direct us specifically towards gushing about one song in particular, that being In the Earthen Womb. For me, this song is incredibly emotional and is happy and sad at the same time, which is one of my personal favorite moods. It plays during the ending moments of the game, where the game drops some of its most profound lines and moments. So, mega spoilers for all of those who care about that. So, during the course of this song playing, Will finds out what happens to his parents. You learn the resolution of some other characters. The game states in clear terms how humankind is disposed towards evil when faced with change that is too fast. You also get to watch the Earth from space and see how beautiful it is. And Will listens to a character explain how the Earth is a caring and lonely mother that is saddened by everyone forgetting about her. I personally interpret the song to represent the beauty of discovering meaning. In the case of the scene, Will is discovering the meanings of his parents, his friends, the evils of humanity, and the Earth itself. Many of these meanings are sad, but in my opinion, the music shows that seeing the bigger picture can still be a beautiful thing. Particularly when you are removed from the pain and the heat of the moment, and you can think about it all from space while observing the beauty of the Earth from afar.
Yeah, I would second that. I think it's a good track. I think it encapsulates everything that you said. I don't know that I would have any particular cons with it. So yeah, I support.
Well, that's good, because if though we'd have some fighting words. No, I'm just kidding.
I will say it's interesting that this game in particular is the only game to have a nomination for both music categories, which seems like it's kind of weird because it makes this score seem like it's a lot better than maybe it actually is. Because I think, I don't know that I would be willing to go that far. I mean, it's largely in because it's kind of, slight spoilers, but it sort of was ranked lower for both Corbett and I, but like high enough that it gets the support from the two of us, and so then it goes in. And so that's kind of where it landed with its position. And yeah, I don't know. I think the music is very commendable because it is very unique. It certainly has a distinctive sound and identity to it, but it also sort of lacks a strong cohesive identity. So it's possible that In the Earthen Womb is the, functions maybe, or has maybe almost a better standing because it doesn't have the responsibilities of taking on the whole game. Whereas like the entire score, I think, seems to have a bit more of a struggle with that because of its reused music, especially certain tracks that don't always feel like they're well placed.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that in some ways the overall soundtrack somewhat reflects Quintet's priorities. It's like Quintet, when they're wanting to say something profound about human nature, oh man, you got that beautiful acid trip music.
Mm-hmm.
And then Quintet, when you have to add a town because it's an RPG and you have to have a town, I don't know, just throw in the town music. It's whatever,
Yeah, that very much feels like how it is. It's like the highs are high and the lows are kind of low. So I think that makes it hard to determine whether or not you put it down because you're like, well, like I'm really struck with like the ones you said, like Signs of the Past and Dark Space. I love that theme. That was just like a really weird, the whole like time turner sound going on in the background. It's like, wow, like this is really interesting. And then like, there's long segments where it's like, yep, that's the dungeon theme again. Yep, that's the town theme once again. So very unusual score, but I like unusual on the best original score list. I think that makes it worthwhile. I think that for me is a great way to kind of disseminate some of the choice, because if you're just going with things you like or things that sound quote unquote good, then I think you miss out on talking about how music does interesting things with the way it creates its portrayal of the game. Like music is sort of like an interpretation of what's happening in the game world. And so finding scores that are willing to take chances by having interesting compositions or interesting instrument choices, this kind of stuff I think is what makes it a worthwhile conversation point when we're talking about the game. So yeah. I'm glad it's here to be discussed on music categories.
Yeah, I would say that in general, my preferences when it comes to Oscarina picks, but also just things in general, is I would much prefer having something that has really high highs, even if it comes with low lows, rather than a game that's just good and well-rounded and so forth. Mm-hmm. And aside from that, it also just gives us a fair amount of stuff to talk about, as evidenced by the fact that we've talked your guys' ear off now for like 10 minutes or whatever, talking about the music in this game.
Yeah. I think I'm pretty... I want to say I think I'm in agreement with you on that topic, just because... I mean, would you agree with that? Like, that I tend to pick scores that have high highs regardless of the low lows?
That's interesting. I don't know if I have enough of a sample size to really be able to peg your choices there, but it wouldn't surprise me if that is your choices.
I think I'm going to think about that. That's interesting. A little bit of self-reflection for you.
So, I think that wraps up all of our categories, other than the final category, which is Best Pixel for 1993. To start things off, as I often like to do, I'll give an overview of how Illusion of Gaia stacks up for the other categories, where it didn't quite earn a nomination. In my opinion, Illusion of Gaia is good at challenge and achievement, discovery and expression, and art direction. It's decent at level design, technical artistry, and fellowship and relaxation, and it's a bit weak in best male character due to the aforementioned characters being a bit generic and underdeveloped.
Yeah, I think that's a good summation. Quintet has grown in recognition over the years for their unique games that were unafraid to put grand themes of human civilization, history, atrocity interlinked with gameplay that has really no equivalent comparison. Their newfound reputation in retrospect makes Illusion of Gaia's Best Pixel nomination an affirmation of their achievements as truly innovative developers who saw game design as boundless realms to explore difficult themes in complicated ways. The grand themes Illusion of Gaia brings up are not widely understood, but this merely makes it worth revisiting. You're going to have to do your own digging and theory crafting to understand its complicated messaging, but I see it as a worthwhile trait. Loom and Castlevania are both fine for what they are, but the replay value for the former is in revisiting a story for pleasure's sake, and the value for the latter is in the challenge and atmosphere of the journey. With Illusion, the replay value is to see if you can make better connections with its layered storytelling to eventually arrive at a more cohesive whole. Where Dragon Quest V sees you return to your childhood, in that game, you go through the different phases of life. But here, in Illusion of Gaia, you are perpetually a child, and that creates a hard cap on what can be gleaned. You could argue this is a fault since it provides less nuance for an adult. However, the more positive outlook is that, in some sense, it validates the problems it talks about because they are all problems with simple solutions that, for one reason or another, are not being solved in real life. And so for me, it's about the sentiment of watching the world carry on, full of faults, and the recognitions that perhaps the thing most of us can do is to be reminded of these crimes, but to remember to carry on all the same. As the game draws to a close, the modern world is ushered in, and rather than be depicted as a terrible thing, it's actually a call to action. Even the final moment in which Will is reunited with his friends in a modern school setting shows that despite the dark histories of the world, the future, although bleak itself, need not always feel this way. And perhaps this hope is that which exists in all of us, is the power of the human spirit. My thinking is that this would match the general positive atmosphere this game seems interested in maintaining. It wants to show the dark sides of humanity, but it doesn't want to crush your spirit in the process. And finding a way to make the brutal pains appear serious and appropriately heavy while refusing to let the player fall into a depressive stupor by the end is quite the challenge. How dark do you go before you have begun to recreate old horrors? How much do you simplify before you've done a disservice to actual historical tragedies? And how do you meld that balance in a video game format? The answer, through the eyes of a child. That coats the entire tale, and for many people, this doesn't work for them. Most people haven't even bothered to remember Illusion of Gaia, but it's my stance that society was maybe a little too quick to dismiss it. I may not fully understand or even agree with all the choices they made when constructing their theses, but it's commendable all the same, and I don't get the sense that the developers aren't aware of their choices. As with many other Quintet games, they have a unique vision, one that doesn't put the pieces together for you, but they do hold your hand along the way. I see Illusion of Gaia as a prime example of their love and critical honesty for humanity, its troubled history, and their rare but important hope for a brighter future. So,
well put, Mitch. Thank you for your contributions.
Thanks. So, what's your interpretation of the game, and how esoteric did you find Illusion of Gaia?
Pretty esoteric, although I personally feel it's not as esoteric as a lot of these other YouTubers are making it out to be. I mean, a lot of them are just like, yeah, the story is just completely incomprehensible. I didn't know what was going on. Whereas it's like, I could usually sort of piece together what was going on in the moment, but maybe like the context interlinking them was a little vague, or like what I had to do next was a little vague, or the character's exact reasoning for making a statement was a little vague. But I don't know, though. I mean, that being said, though, I'm a person who loves, like, don't hug me, I'm scared. So I love me my esoteric games. So I might have a higher tolerance for that than most. So on the whole, like, I'd give it like maybe a 6.5 out of 10 on the esoteric scale compared to what I'm used to on esoteric media.
So I guess I'm curious, because you don't mind the level of esotericness that's in the game, but also it's not quite deep enough for you either. So it's kind of like a big pro and a big con. Would that be correct?
Yeah, I would say so. And I will say that the esotericness, I don't mind it in other media where I feel like the esotericness adds to the atmosphere. Whereas here, I felt like it was more just caused by iffy translation and not going in depth enough on things. So, you know, it still bothered me a little bit, but it wasn't a super big drawback, just more of a nitpick, you know, that was sort of embedded throughout a lot of the experience. Minor annoyance, more or less. But yeah, for me, my more annoyance is the fact that I wanted more exploration on the topics that they brought up. I mean, it still has loads of meaning, especially when you compared it to other action RPGs of the time, but more is always good, you know, and more in-depth is also always good.
Yeah, well put. I agree with that. Okay, well, if you're curious to play Illusion of Gaia yourself, you are pretty much stuck with the original Super Nintendo version, I'm afraid. It would be nice to see the unofficially named Gaia trilogy be brought to modern consoles, but as of this recording, no such option exists. So with that, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining me tonight. Thank you, Corbett, for your insight into Illusion of Gaia.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure getting to nerd out with you.
Indeed. Illusion of Gaia is up for 7 awards at this year's Oscarinas. The winners will be announced in October on Oscarina Saturday. And if Illusion of Gaia wins Best Pixel, the Academy will have chosen a game ahead of its time and one that is deserving of reappraisal.